Hello and welcome back to Telecare's online training. Today we are looking at Unit 4, which is Sexuality and Gender. So just to pick up where we left off, we're going to start part 1. So learning objectives for Unit 4 are that by the end of this section, you will have a basic understanding of terms, words, and definitions, acceptable uses of terms, and identifying and dealing with illegitimate calls. There are many aspects to sexuality and gender that someone could want to discuss with a volunteer. We might feel calls from someone who is questioning their sexual orientation or gender identity, someone who is living under the repression of homophobia, someone who is unsure of how to come out. We could be listening to a parent or friend of a 2S LGBTQI+ person trying to understand something that is not the norm for them. Telecare is a gender and sex affirming service. It is imperative that we use language that communicates this, including someone's preferred pronouns, no matter what personal beliefs we may hold. When speaking of sexuality, we must also be aware of the issues of teenage sexuality, including unplanned pregnancy and STIs. These topics can provoke much unease for both the people struggling and their loved ones. There are numerous stereotypes and misconceptions, making talking about it even more difficult. The unknown often causes fear and anxiety. In this section, we will learn some of the appropriate terms and language. We hope to build a better understanding of sexuality in order that we can listen and support our callers in a non-judgmental manner. Terminology and acronyms are continuously evolving. Based on extensive consultation with 2S LGBTQI+ communities across the country, the Government of Canada will adopt and encourage the use of the 2S LGBTQI+ acronym, which is more inclusive and places the experience of Indigenous communities at the foreground as the first 2S LGBTQI+ peoples in North America. This acronym stands for Two-Spirit, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, Intersex, and additional sexually and gender diverse people. Be aware of the language specific callers use, as these terms are the ones they are most comfortable with. Please mirror this language as best as you can. If a caller refers to themselves as queer, say that and avoid other terms, such as gay. Be aware of the pronouns a caller uses to identify themselves. Never assume a caller's gender based on the sound of their voice. Avoid using the terms like sir, ma'am, and other gendered phrases. If using this language is new to you, give yourself some compassion. You'll make mistakes, and it's okay to correct yourself when speaking to a caller. Sex and gender. The words sex and gender are commonly used interchangeably, and the simple dictionary definition of each of them is the same. However, they are quite different. For example, sexuality is the sexual habits and desires of a person. Sex is the male, female, or sometimes intersex division of a species, especially as differentiated with reference to the female, to the reproductive functions or physical characteristics such as genitals, XX and XY chromosomes, etc. Gender. This is a noun that refers to the concept or system of categories such as male and female. A glossary of 2S LGBTQI+ terms. In keeping with the atmosphere of respect and non-judgmental listening, it is imperative that we are able to connect with our callers where they are. To this end, learning appropriate terms is important. However, keep in mind that being open to learning and exploring callers' needs is just as effective as knowing the terms. Gender identity. It can refer to the internal and deeply felt sense of being a man or a woman, both or neither. A person's gender identity may or may not align with the gender typically associated with their sex. It may change over the course of one's lifetime. Gender fluid. A person whose gender identity varies over time and may include male, female, and non-binary gender identities, non-binary and genderqueer. referring to a person whose gender identity does not align with a binary understanding of gender, such as man or woman. It is a gender identity which may include man or woman and androgynous, fluid, multiple, no gender, or a different gender outside of the woman or man spectrum. Gender dysphoria, a medical diagnosis often required by healthcare providers and or health insurance plans before prescriptions for hormones or gender-affirming surgeries will be provided. It can be understood as discomfort or distress experienced by a person who feels their sense of gender identity differs from their body based on societal expectations. Transgender, also referred to as trans, a person whose gender identity differs from what is typically associated with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Transphobia, the fear, hatred, or aversion of people whose gender identities differ from the sex they were assigned at birth. And transsexual, it should be noted that this term is no longer commonly used, though it may be more frequently used by transgender individuals of an older cohort. The term defines a person whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth and who has undertaken gender-affirming medical and or surgical interventions. The term has fallen out of favor as it implies that physical transition is necessary in order to claim a trans identity. Sexual orientation. This refers to romantic and sexual attraction for people of the same or another sex or gender. Aromantic, a person who lacks romantic attraction or interest in romantic expression. An aromantic person's sexual and romantic orientations may differ. For example, an aromantic lesbian, and they may have romantic and or sexual partners. Asexual, a person who lacks sexual attraction or interest in sexual expression. An asexual person's sexual and romantic orientations may differ. For example, a biromantic asexual, and they may have sexual and or romantic partners. Bisexual or biromantic, a person who is sexually and or romantically attracted to two or more genders. Biphobia, the fear, hatred, or aversion of people who are attracted to more than one gender. Gay, a person who is sexually and or romantically attracted to people of their same sex or gender identity. Traditionally, this identity was reserved for men, but it has been adopted by people of all gender identities. Heterosexual or heteroromantic, a person who is sexually and or romantically attracted to people of a different gender than themselves. Homosexual, this is no longer commonly used in English. See gay and lesbian. The term homosexual has fallen out of favor as it is associated with the historic medical understanding of same-sex attraction as mental illness. However, equivalents of homosexual are commonly used in French and other languages. Homophobia, the fear, hatred, or aversion of people who experience same-sex attraction. Lesbian, typically a woman who is sexually and or romantically attracted to other women. Pansexual, a person whose choice of sexual or romantic partners is not limited by the other person's sex, gender identity, or gender expression. Omnisexual, a person who is attracted to all genders and who may have gender preferences based on preferred gender expression. There may be some differences in different workplace or agency settings with some specifics of some of these terms. When in doubt, just ask. Sex. The male, female, or sometimes intersex division of a species, especially as differentiated with reference to the reproductive functions or physical characteristics such as genitals, XX and XY chromosomes, etc. Cisgender, a person who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth, often shortened to cis. Intersex, an umbrella term to capture various types of biological sex differentiation. Intersex people have variations in their sex characteristics, such as sex chromosomes, internal reproductive organs, genitalia, and or secondary sex characteristics. Example, muscle mass, breasts, that fall outside of what is typically categorized as male or female. Non-binary or gender neutral, a person that does not identify themselves by the male-female binary. Gender expression. Gender expression refers to the various ways in which people choose to express their gender identity. For example, clothes, voice, hair, makeup, etc. A person's gender expression may not align with societal expectations of gender. It is therefore not a reliable indicator of a person's gender identity. Cross-dressing. It is the practice of wearing clothes that are usually associated with the other sex according to gender norms. Cross-dressing may be practiced by people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. Drag queens and drag kings. Drag queens and kings are distinct from cross-dressers because they dress for the purpose of performance and entertainment, often wearing elaborate costumes and makeup. Usually, a drag queen is someone who performs femininity, while a drag king performs masculinity. Drag may be practiced by people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. Some broader terms. Queer. Historically, this was a derogatory term used as a slur against 2S LGBTQI plus people. This term has been reclaimed by many people as a positive way to describe themselves and often as a way to include the many diverse identities not covered by common 2S LGBTQI plus acronym. Questioning. A person who is uncertain about their sexual orientation and or gender identity. This could be a transitory or lasting identity. Two-spirit. Also, two-spirit or two-spirited. This is an English term used to broadly capture concepts traditional to many Indigenous cultures. It is a culturally specific identity used by some Indigenous people to indicate a person's gender identity, spiritual identity, and or sexual identity. If you're following along with the app, this would be a time that you can pause this video and play this video on pronouns on a supported device. Otherwise, this will be linked at the end of the video. All right. So in talking about pronouns, some volunteers ask how they should talk to and refer to transgender individuals. This is a great question. When referring to a transgender person, you should always use the person's preferred third person pronoun, such as he, him, she, her, they, them, and name. If you're uncertain which pronoun is appropriate for a person, you should respectfully ask that person rather than make an assumption. If you accidentally use the wrong pronoun for someone, it's okay to apologize and correct yourself. Please note to use transgender and not transgendered, which is considered incorrect. For example, to say Max is transgendered is incorrect, but to say Max is transgender or Max is a transgender man would be more correct. Keep in mind that transgender should always be used as an adjective and never as a noun. In addition, it is common for transgender folks to shorten the term and simply use the term trans. For example, Max is trans is commonly acceptable within the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. Now that we've completed part 1, we will move on to part 2. All right, so after we've discussed definitions, let's get into more application of these concepts. For example, the Kinsey scale. So the heterosexual homosexual rating scale, sometimes referred to as the Kinsey scale, was developed by Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues Wardell Pomeroy and Clyde Martin in 1948 in order to account for research findings that showed people did not fit into neat and exclusive heterosexual or homosexual categories. There was no test developed by Kinsey for the scale. Rather, findings were taken from a series of interviews. Several tests have subsequently been developed. The scale is purely a method of self-evaluation based on your individual preference, and the rating you choose may change over time. So what this looks like is 0 indicates no attraction for the same sex. 1 may fantasize about the same sex. 2 may have experimented with the same sex or had a relationship with the same sex. 3 may have experimented, fantasized, or had relationships with both sexes. 4 may fantasize about the opposite sex. 5 may have experimented with the opposite sex or had a relationship with the opposite sex. And 6, no attraction for the opposite sex. As Kinsey writes in Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 1948, males do not represent two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats. The living world is a continuum in each and every one of its aspects. It is this continuum, this ever changing for some self evaluation of identity and sexual nature that can cause a person to be troubled, to have questions, to feel alone, different, or unsupported, and ultimately to lead a call to telecare. There are lines dedicated to sexual health and identity. However, we notice that when a person is questioning their sexuality, it can be difficult to call a dedicated service. Once a person has explored their feelings in a safe and non judgmental place like Telecare, then we're able to provide a referral for ongoing information, validation, and support. Make no mistake, hiding one's true self away in a closet and creating a facade of heterosexuality is not without consequences. It may appear to have a degree of safety, but from my experience, they are very unhealthy places and do all kinds of terrible things to individuals psychologically, emotionally, and behaviorally. To say nothing of projection, the damage of the fear, shame, guilt, and self loathing that exist inside a closet are often reflected unknowingly in the external life of the individual. In or out of the closet, there is a price to pay. Each individual must weigh up the consequences of honesty, openness, secrecy, and deception for themselves. Coming out, for most of us, is like an exorcism that releases us out of the darkness that we have lived in for years and causes us to believe awful things about ourselves. On the other side of the looking glass are freedom, light, and life. Outing someone is like ripping a butterfly from its cocoon. You can damage them for life and rob them of their life changing experience of liberation. For successful emergence, they have to struggle through the cocoon of fear and shame, and then they can fly. That's an excerpt from Anthony Van Brown's A Life of Unlearning, A Journey to Find the Truth. The above quotes by author, evangelist, and an ambassador for gay rights sums up nicely the reason that someone might be calling telecare just to explore their feelings. So coming out. Coming out is a process through which 2S LGBTQI plus people disclose their sexual orientation to themselves and others. It is also a process through which transgender persons can experiment with gender identities until they find the one that fits. Coming out can be a difficult and terrifying process, as some family and friends can and sometimes do react badly. Therefore, we may encounter callers who want to discuss coming out with us, as we are anonymous and confidential. Van Wormer and her colleagues in 2000 identified a number of stages of coming out. These stages can prove to be helpful if you have a caller who is struggling with their sexual orientation. It is important to understand that not everyone who is 2S LGBTQI plus go through these stages or necessarily goes through them in the order that Van Wormer presents. Also, people can be content without moving through all the stages. So, a review of stage one. The first stage occurs before a person comes out. People in this stage may feel discomfort, but do not consciously recognize themselves as being attracted to people of the same sex or as not fitting in with their assigned gender at birth. Two, the second stage takes place when people begin to become aware of their same sex attraction or their gender discomfort. Three, in the third stage, exploration, people develop gay, lesbian, or transgender friendships and participate in the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. Four, the final stage is marked by integration, in which people accept their identities and incorporate their identities into their lives. So, what can telecare volunteers do to help? As a volunteer, you may feel helpless at times. However, there are ways that you can be an ally to our callers experiencing struggles with their sexual identity or orientation. Step one, help ease the isolation felt by our callers. Help them feel as though solidarity is possible. Create a welcoming, safe, non-judgmental environment for callers to explore feelings. Two, as a volunteer and a community member, you can help by ending shame and fighting for full equality and social acceptance. Three, Use inclusive language. Learn the appropriate language and use it when appropriate. 4. Create a general atmosphere of respect for human diversity. Stigma. People who identify as anything other than heterosexual have long been stigmatized. It is only since the late 1960s, with the rise of the gay political movement in North America, that the perception of homosexuality as a moral, criminal, and sick has come under increasing scrutiny. In 1963, the American Psychiatric Association dropped homosexuality as a diagnosis, and the question of why some heterosexuals harbor strongly negative attitudes towards homosexuality began to receive serious scientific consideration. There are many harmful results of homophobia and transphobia, including violence and discrimination. Some of our callers may be experiencing something called internalized trans or homophobia, a phobia directed against themselves. This can result in a lifetime of suffering, including depression, low self-esteem, and a stunted love, life, and sexuality. Some psychologists and psychiatrists attribute the much higher incidence of suicide among gay teenagers as due to this. Homophobia also harms non-gay people as well. Warren J. Blumenfeld argues that the effects of homophobia harm heterosexuals as well. He states that anti-gay bias causes people to avoid or have trouble forming close relationships with friends of the same sex. Homophobia restricts people to rigid gender roles. Even if people are in actuality straight, they may be silenced or ridiculed into not fulfilling their potential by avoiding the creative, fulfilling, but stigmatized activity. Anti-gay bias causes young people to engage in sexual behavior earlier to prove that they are straight. Anti-gay bias inhibits the ability of schools to create effective, honest sexual education programs that could save children's lives and prevent STIs. So once again, homophobia is a noun, and it is an irrational fear of, aversion to, or discrimination against homosexuality or homosexuals. Heterosexism is a discrimination or prejudice by heterosexuals against homosexuals. Same-sex marriage. On July 20th, 2005, Canada became the fourth country in the world and the first country outside Europe to legalize same-sex marriage nationwide, with the enactment of the Civil Marriage Act, which provided a gender-neutral marriage definition. Court decisions starting in 2003 had already legalized same-sex marriage in 8 out of 10 provinces and 1 of 3 territories. Most legal benefits commonly associated with marriage have been extended to cohabitating same-sex couples since 1999. The presence of children aged 24 and under in the home and gender of same-sex parents in private households of Canada 2011 census showed 9.4% of same-sex parents raising kids, 80.3% of those are female same-sex parents, 19.7% of those are male same-sex parents, and that source is from StatsCan in the 2011 census population. Many stereotypes and prejudices surround this sensitive topic that may influence the values of both the speakers and the listeners. At Telecare, we offer all callers the same listening support. We respect the values and beliefs of all volunteers as much as those of our callers. If there is any issue or conversation that you feel uncomfortable with and you feel that you cannot provide non-judgmental support, please refer the caller to an appropriate agency. That completes part 2, and we'll move along to part 3. All right, so now we are going to move into a little bit of a different topic to discuss birth control, safe sex, and abortion. So similar to previous discussions, we all have our own beliefs and values around sex and topics like abortion. It is important to stay neutral and non-judgmental on these subjects when listening to our callers. If you receive a legitimate call from someone who is questioning their sexual activities, these questions might help the caller explore their feelings, such as, are you pressured to have sex? How does premarital sex align with your religious or moral beliefs? How do you think having sex will affect your relationship? Have you thought about an unplanned pregnancy or STIs? Have you thought about your reasons for or not having sex? What are your thoughts on birth control, and have you discussed this with your partner? It is not our place to judge, but rather to give our callers a safe place to explore their feelings. If you feel that you are unable to listen and explore in a non judgmental manner, please refer our callers to something like the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit and other referral resources throughout this training, as well as in the call center. So the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit offers counseling on sexuality, birth control, pregnancy, STIs, anonymous testing for HIV/AIDS, birth control prescription, pregnancy confirmation, and treatment of STIs. They provide follow-up and referrals, including abortion and adoption. They work with communities to address sexuality concerns. Women can feel alone or isolated when they are faced with an unplanned pregnancy. They may feel that it is hard to talk with the people they would normally reach out to for support. Some people can be very judgmental. When you're around judgmental people, you may feel bad about yourself or your decisions. Our job is to be supportive, to help explore feelings, and provide professional resources as appropriate in order that the caller can do what is best for themselves and their family or their future family. And then there are sex callers. Sorry, the legitimate sex callers. So responding to legitimate sex calls involves utilizing active listening skills. The caller would like to share their thoughts and feelings surrounding a sexual issue. Volunteers can provide emotional support through reflecting feelings, asking open-ended questions, summarizing, clarifying, and exploring options. If, as a volunteer, you are uncomfortable discussing legitimate sexual issues, you may offer a referral to an appropriate agency. It is important that you do not impose your own sexual values on the caller. On the other hand, illegitimate callers are usually seeking different kinds of conversations, um, such as seeking sexual stimulation, gratification, and arousal, um, attempting to achieve these things by creating a fantasy with the volunteer, either through hearing the voice of the volunteer or through the caller describing their own sex fantasy. They may try to gratify themselves on the phone, or they may not want to discuss their feelings about the problem. Once a sex call is suspected, you are free to immediately hang up. So, on the topic of recognizing an illegitimate sex caller, with experience reading call reports, frequent caller book and guidelines, and discussion with senior volunteers and staff, identifying illegitimate sex calls will become easier. Sex callers are often repeat callers, use various aliases, immediately ask your name, and then give their own. This is done for two purposes: to establish the fantasy of the relationship and to discern whether they have spoken to this particular listener before. They may ask personal questions, use the term embarrassing quite frequently, present with childish innocence about sex, and they may be whispering or using a quiet tone. Some common story themes of illegitimate sex calls are topics surrounding dominant women, asking for sexual information or advice, sex organs being too large or too small, sex with female members of immediate or extended family, lending partners to another man or to another partner, discussing multiple sexual participants, enjoying sex with minors, transvesticism, fetishism, voyeurism, exhibitionism, such as including being watched during sexual activity alone or with a partner, nudity, humiliation, sadomasochism, bladder control, landlord or landlady spying on the caller, using a friend's mother in a situation, um, or describing a first same sex experience and wanting to know if this indicates a person's sexuality. That being said, in a legitimate call, this would likely not be mentioned as an opening comment, and that just kind of helps to differentiate a legitimate from an illegitimate call. 6 general categories of illegitimate sex calls um, include the one-liner, one who opens the call with obscene language, probably for shock effect. Um, at, to this, to respond to this, offer no response and just hang up. 2, the masturbator, one who uses the volunteer's voice for stimulation. These callers can be quite clever, and you may be well into the conversation before the purpose of the call. When you suspect the caller is masturbating, or if the caller admits to it, confront them with something such as, "This is an inappropriate use of the line. When we can have a meaningful conversation, please call back," and disconnect the call. 3, the verbal exhibitionist, one who resorts to very graphic descriptions of sexual terms or their own experiences, and who may ask you to relate your own experiences or definitions for stimulation. So to respond, confront the caller. Ask, "Why do you need to tell me this?" Or say, "I don't need this information." If the caller continues to give explicit detail, you can say, "This is an inappropriate use of our lines," or, "I am not qualified or comfortable to discuss these issues with you. I can give you a referral to speak to a professional." Do not prolong the call or divulge details of your own personal life. Refer the caller to an appropriate service. 4, the fantasizer. Similar to number 3, this is the caller who goes into a great deal of detail and description but does not want a conversation. The caller enjoys their own fantasies more than your own voice, and therefore the result would be the same as 3, which is disconnecting the call. The manipulator, one who invents a story or problem, often lengthy, to attempt to get you to talk about your sexual feelings and experiences. Once again, you are free to disconnect the call. 6, the exhibitionist, the caller who says they are an exhibitionist. Could be a number 3 or number 4 caller. The caller needs professional help. Refer them to their family doctor, therapist, or sexuality clinic. If you recognize the sex caller story, it is appropriate to say something along the lines of, "Oh yes, we have spoken about this problem before. Have you followed up with any of the resources I have given you?" Often the caller will hang up. Responding to illegitimate sex calls. These calls can be upsetting, as they can leave you feeling many things, such as angry, shocked, frustrated, or abused. Remember that the caller does not know you and is not calling you personally, but is calling the distress center. Volunteers are not expected to provide support to illegitimate sex callers. However, it is important that you don't impose your own sexual values on our callers. If you feel uncomfortable at any time, offer a referral if applicable, or end the call. Therefore, remember to keep control of the call. Do not allow the call to carry on after you have identified an illegitimate sex call. Be firm with the caller. For example, say, "If you want to talk, fine. If you want to masturbate, our service is not for this purpose." Or say, "This is an inappropriate use of the line." If you suspect the caller is self-gratifying, hang up. Practice silence. This can be handy, as callers may be using your voice to self-gratify. Be firm, terminate, even if they are mid-sentence, or beg you to stay on the line. This is a good reminder to let the caller do the talking. If callers genuinely wish to discuss their feelings, then let them do the bulk of the talking. Use your silence technique learned in an earlier unit. You will soon find out if this is a legitimate call or not. If a caller admits to having masturbated while talking to you, hang up. Do not allow the caller to give explicit sexual details. And lastly, terminate the call if you say that you are going to. Don't threaten to hang up and then stay on the line. Your safety is our priority. All right, and that concludes Unit 4. If you're following along on another device with the app, you can continue to self-evaluation. Otherwise, we will continue next time with Unit 5, which is spirituality and culture. Thank you so much.